Right, yeah, welcome also from our side. I mean, just to give you a heads up, this is going to be a joint presentation between the two of us. He is a co-worker of mine, and I wanted him to also speak about the work he did for OVITO. So we're going to switch the stage in between. We are going to speak about scaling up atomistic simulations by developing post-processing methods and tools. So we are going to speak about the steps that come after running simulations and getting towards scientific insights. So we come from the atomistic modeling direction. So here, molecular dynamics is a very popular method, as we've seen this week, because it has a lot of, it provides all the degrees of freedom that are necessary to predict complex behavior. On the other hand, it's conceptually and technically a very simple approach, right? You only need some notion of how atoms interact. You can use different models for that, of course, going from ab initio to classical potentials and machine learning potentials, depending on what you choose. Of course, you can simulate different system sizes, material structures with characteristic structure sizes. And since, if you have a model that is short ranged, you can also scale that up to very large systems and using exascale computing power. I picked up this number, 0.5 trillion atoms that we heard about on Monday, so we keep pushing the limits on the size of simulations, at least, that it can be performed. The question that arises then is, what do we do with all the data that comes out of these kinds of huge scale simulations? How can we learn something from them? What kind of tools do we need to extract useful and insightful information from them? I also like to use this kind of analogy with lab experiments. Lab experimentalists, they use all sorts of microscopy and imaging techniques to visualize what is happening or what goes on inside of a material, what kind of structures are present, what kind of processes take place. And similarly, we as computational scientists need computational tools to visualize data sets and to make sense of the raw simulation data. So this is the work we do. We develop tools, methods, and software tools that help with these tasks. There are, at least three reasons or purposes or goals that we pursue with these developments. One is, of course, to visualize structures and processes and to understand atomic level processes. The second purpose is data reduction. These massive MD simulations produce so much data that you cannot store it anymore. You have to boil it down to manageable sizes and extract the relevant features. And the third goal is to build a bridge between the atomistic scale and higher scale mesoscopic descriptions of materials and corresponding theories. So I want to keep you these three goals in mind because we will come back to these things throughout this talk. So nowadays our work is mostly focused on this first area. So we develop a software tool which is called OVITO, which was mentioned also in Tom's presentation. This is a desktop application for visualizing and post-processing atomistic simulations. So it has a rich feature set. It is designed to cover all particle-based simulation models, ranging from small ab initio models to classical molecular dynamics, coarse-grained models, even macroscopic scale discrete element simulations. So the major selling point for this software, why people use it, is it provides a data pipeline concept that allows you to, in a very flexible manner, build up processing pipelines that solve your specific analysis problem. So you build up a sequence of modifier steps, we call them. So they perform simple tasks, and the software provides a rich tool set of these modifiers. But you can even develop your own types of modifier functions. And the software then computes the results of this pipeline almost in real time and visualizes or displays it on screen. And you can always go back and change things, rearrange these steps. So you have this kind of non-destructive editing workflow. So this approach has been very successful. OVITO has become one of the mostly used tools in this area. This also shows in the number of publications that we can count. Also nowadays, almost 5 to 6 new papers appear every day that make use of OVITO in some way or the other. And with this kind of success, of course, it also comes a lot of responsibility and work. I mean, I have always been, until 2020, I've been doing this on the side, basically, as a voluntary work. And at some point, of course, you have to ask the question, how can you continue? How can you keep a software project like OVITO alive and in a sustainable manner? I think this is a question that many software projects in the academic world are facing, right? I mean, how can you maintain a software, a large code base in the long run? And what are your options to solve that problem? I mean, you can, of course, keep applying for funding, get research grants, but they are typically short-term and require you to do research. They don't pay you for maintaining software, providing user support, and so on. I mean, at least in Germany, this is difficult. It's a difficult situation. It's getting better, and I think in the US already it is to some extent better. You can try to build up an open source community to basically outsource some of the work to other people, external people, hope that they join in. And I have the feeling this does not fully solve the problem, or can never fully solve the problem, because you always need a core team taking care of maintenance tasks and things like that. So somehow you still have to pay for this work. You can ask your users for financial contributions. You get to that, yeah. So you can ask for donations, but I think this is hopeless. This will not be sufficient, especially in Germany. Our users are typically public institutions. They have strict spending rules. They cannot give money to something that is available for free. So last option, license fees, and this I think is a fair model because it distributes the burden onto many shoulders, and on the other hand, our users, customers now can be sure that we address their needs, right, in our software project. So this is the way we went 3 years ago. We are now basically a company founded in Germany. Currently, we are 3 people working full time for OVITO. 2/3 of that group is present in this room. I mean, Daniel will say some more about it. We have set up a freemium business model, a licensing model. So we have a free version of OVITO. It's called OVITO Basic, providing basic functionalities. You can already do a lot of things with this software. It's open source. This is important. People can look at how things are implemented. We have the OVITO Python package, making all the functions, analysis functions, visualization functions available for integration into third-party workflows or other software. And we have OVITO Pro, which is the paid software with the full feature set. Sorry, I'm going a little bit off topic here, but I thought this might be of interest to some of you at least. I mean, we are focused on academic users. So you see here the blue fraction and the red fraction. These are universities and governmental institutions like national labs, so they fund our work mostly. So one important aspect of OVITO is that it provides what we maybe can describe as an interactive development platform for data processing algorithms. So we want to enable our users to develop their own specific processing algorithms, and OVITO provides an interactive environment for that. So we have a whole set of foundational algorithms. We have the very comprehensive Python API, and we have visualization capabilities. So you can write Python-based analysis functions and directly visualize the results of these algorithms. Of course, you can also incorporate the whole packages from the Python ecosystem, integrate machine learning procedures and things like that. So I'm going to show one example first, or a showcase for these things. Right now, I want to ask Daniel on stage. He's going to speak about the development in this area here, foundational algorithms. So these are things like neighbor finding, that you always need atomic structure identification, but also surface reconstruction. That means how can we get from an atomistic model towards a geometric description of the shape of that solid that is formed by a set of particles. All right.
Thank you.
So I have to give you the mic.
Yeah.
Sorry. Take care of this.
Yeah. So you can take it. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah. So how do we go about these core algorithms that are built into OVITO out of the box that you can access from the modifier dropdown? First of all, we start with a problem that users might encounter. So in this case, the problem is you want to do research on voids and pores in your material. They are important in material science as they act as one of the failure mechanisms that you might encounter in your batteries or also in structural materials. And so there is interest in researching them from the computational side. However, they come with a problem because in normal atomistic simulation, we simulate the atoms. However, voids are basically the absence of atoms. So you kind of have to find something inside your simulation that is not simulated directly, but is only implicitly encoded in the atoms that you have. One method you can use is the so-called Gaussian density method, where you start off with the superposition of 3D Gaussian functions that are centered on your atom points that you get from your simulation. You then create a voxel grid, put it over the simulation domain, and calculate the function value for your density field on all these grid points. You can then use an established method like marching cubes to basically construct a surface mesh or an isosurface on this field. So in this case, this would be the red outline we can see here around these two atoms or these two Gaussians on the atomic positions. And this border that you construct using the marching cubes algorithm then gives you the interface of what you will call filled and unfilled regions. So this is pretty well established. So it has the big benefit compared to other methods that you actually implicitly take a finite size of your atoms into account, which is, again, not simulated, but something that people usually want or expect from this kind of analysis. Now, I'll show you a very brief example. So if we take a block of material that has some voids inside, and we just look at a slab from the center, it would look something like this. So we have many, many million atoms, and then somehow there are some holes punched into it. If we then apply the algorithm that I just briefly outlined, we can see that we can reconstruct these basically spherical voids using this method. However, this just gives us a surface manifold, so a triangle mesh, without any additional information about the volume that is enclosed by the mesh or how they are interconnected. So we do not have any volumetric information. We just get this border mesh. So this is a limitation of the marching cube algorithm, and it basically prevents us from doing anything useful with the output because we cannot calculate a void size distribution or connectivity map or anything. And this restriction comes from the fact that this method actually constructs these surfaces element-wise for each voxel and not for the whole sample at one time. And so the question is, can we solve this limitation for our users and make new features available? To run you through this process, we are first going to have a look at the marching cubes algorithm, how it is like usually described. So you start off with some density fields that is somewhere in your space. This is a 2D example, but it works the same in 3D. You then have your grid, so this would be our voxel grid, and you need to be able to evaluate basically the field on all these grid points. When you do that, you get basically a classification where you have the field value at these corners, and then you can classify them as interior or exterior based on this field value. So in this case, all the red points are inside, all the blue points are like outside or exterior points. And now we want to reconstruct the blue shape just from these points. To do that, we add some supporting vertices along the transition edges. So basically, every time you go from red to blue, you somehow add a point in between. And then you connect these supporting vertices. Again, this is pretty boring in 2D because you just draw lines to reconstruct your original field or your original shape. However, in 3D, this becomes a lot more complicated because now you have many, many possible facets that you can construct along these field interfaces. Here are some examples of these 3D motifs. So we have 3 different ones, always separating the green from the red region. So in this case, this one might be interior, green might be exterior. They range from pretty simple to rather complicated. There are 33 different ones, which results in about 700 tilings when you exclude symmetry. And these are tabulated. You can download tables from the internet and make this yourself. It's not super difficult. However, this is where the limitation comes from, because standard marching cubes only has this information. It knows, okay, there's some kind of field region here, some kind of field region here. So I just draw a border in between, hope for the best. And what we now had to do was basically add information to this. So instead of just labeling regions filled and unfilled, we went through all the different marching cubes motifs that exist and labeled independent regions. So here we know that there is a filled region here, a filled region here, but we also know that within this square, there's no connection between them. So they're actually disconnected and 2 different regions and not the same one. And then we also know that in the middle, there's an empty region, which we call region 3. So this is the steps that we had to go through in 2D, or in 3D, it looks something like this, where you have maybe one region here, the green one, which is then separated by this blue region, which wraps around the green one. Again, these can be tabulated for efficient lookup, so you don't have to run all this characterization at runtime. You just have to do it once. The second thing is, as I mentioned, we want the volume for each of these voxels or for each of these regions. So we somehow have to figure that out as well. This means in the 2D case, we need to close off these corners, and then we're able to calculate the volume. So we had to add additional supporting triangles, supporting lines to our data or to our table. We can then fill the different regions, calculate their volumes. So in 3D, it looks something like this. So basically, you have your region, this weird shape here, looks like a croissant. And then you add a lot of facets on the voxel faces to basically close off this region and allow you a per voxel volume determination. Again, these additional triangles can also be tabulated, so you don't have to do this work at runtime. Then you implement some supporting code, and you can test it out, and it looks something like this. Here we have our starting configuration again. If we now run the Gaussian density method, we can see we still get the surface meshes. They look the same. It's usually a good sign, because that means you didn't break code that already existed. And we also now see that they are actually identified as separate subvolumes. So we can now color code them based on whether they're connected or not. So we can see these are all different voids that are not connected underneath in the hidden part. And we can then also resolve the surface area and volume for each of them and create statistics, which can then be used further up the processing or publication pipeline of your work. Another application is to basically turn this inside out. So instead of being interested in voids in your material, you might be interested in filled region. So this can happen, for example, for polymers. When you have polymer chains that are inside some matrix, you might be interested in the volume fraction of polymer. So we have some polymer chains here. We can then construct the surface wall or the surfaces around them. You can see it's actually not one chain, but 3 disconnected chains that are intertwined. Let the algorithm run, and then you can see that we can get separate volume, whether they're filled or not, and the surface areas for each of them, which can then be compared to the remainder of the box to obtain a volume fraction that your polymer makes up, which can then be fed into other consecutive laws or whatever you need. This brings me to the end of this core algorithm. It's basically how we usually proceed. We identify some problems that the community might have, and then try to address them for upcoming releases. Now I give back to Alex to talk about dislocations.
There you go. Okay, let's a second. So this was not planned. I mean, we're not prepared for a microphone. So I have to apologize for that. But okay, here we go. Yeah, back to a new topic, or a more material science topic, dislocations. Dislocations are an inherently multi-scale phenomenon, as you all know. So they are determined by things that happen on the atomic scale, at the dislocation core level, but also by things that happen on larger scales because we have these long-reaching interaction stresses. So the collective motion of dislocations is determined on the mesoscopic scale or on continuum scale. So one of the long-standing problems or question was, how can we make this step from the atomistic world to this mesoscopic model of dislocations, where we described it in terms of discrete lines and Burgers vectors. The solution that we developed at least 10 years ago is the so-called Dislocation Extraction Algorithm. This is the method that appeared in Tom's talk. So it can take a snapshot from an atomistic simulation, atomic configuration as input, processes it in several steps, and then spits out the discrete dislocation lines inside of that simulation model, including the Burgers vector information. So I can give you a brief overview of the steps involved. I mean, the first step is an atomic structure identification. So we identify the perfect crystal atoms surrounding the dislocations. Then a Delaunay tessellation is constructed to basically carve out the core regions or the core volume of the dislocation or defects. And then a Burgers circuit search is performed to actually identify dislocations. Once a circuit is found, it is swept along the dislocation core to build up this discrete line representation of the dislocation. I think Vasily Bulatov showed this also in the first workshop here. That's why I also put up this work. So this has been used, this method, in many simulation studies. So we have almost 1,500 publications making use of DXA. And it has enabled this kind of cross-scale modeling approach for the collective behavior of dislocations in metal plasticity. What I want to speak about today is not what you can do with DXA, but what are the still missing capabilities. So what are future development goals? One is the application of DXA to more complex crystal structures. Right now we are limited to simple BCC and FCC-like structures. So we want to extend that towards more crystal structures, more complex unit cells. Interfacial line defects. So the DXA is made for lattice dislocations, to some extent also grain boundary dislocations, but it cannot deal with more complex interfacial defects yet. And finally, parallelization. I mean, we talk about exascale computing. DXA currently is, or the implementation we have in OVITO is a serial code. It cannot operate on distributed data. So that's something we definitely have to work on, and Daniel is going to speak about that later. Let me say a few words about that first area. So here's again how DXA works. So we start off with a atomic configuration, then two things happen. We construct a Delaunay tessellation based on the atomic coordinates, and we perform a structure identification using a CNA-based method to identify crystalline regions. So this establishes a mapping between the physical atoms and an ideal lattice described in terms of a unit cell. And then we map this information back onto the Delaunay tessellation. So for each edge of the tessellation, connecting two atoms A and B, we determine a corresponding ideal crystal lattice vector. And this collective information then basically establishes a discretized continuum field, elastic continuum field. And then that's when the magic happens. So then when DXA analyzes that field to extract incompatibilities and then extract these dislocations. So notably, all these steps here happen basically independently from the underlying atomistic information. So in principle, we can replace or plug in other methods at this step. So far we are using common neighbor analysis, polyhedral template matching for that. But modern approaches, like this one here, they are capable of classifying more complex atomic structures. And we want to incorporate maybe some of these methods. But right now they are not suitable yet for DXA because they do not provide a mapping of neighboring atoms to ideal lattice directions. So that's something that needs to be developed first. Now I want to speak about a little bit more about the interfacial defects. So line defects in crystal interfaces play an important role for many materials phenomena. With crystal interfaces, we mean both grain boundaries, separating two crystallites with the same structure but different orientation, but also interface boundaries separating two different phases. So the defects that live inside of these interfaces are disconnections. They have both step and dislocation character. So the Burgers vector accommodates the mismatch and the misorientation between the crystallites or grains, and the step is what is in many cases enables the migration of the interface. They are difficult to identify by hand, or very cumbersome, because they represent, of course, defects inside of other defects in some sense. And it would be really helpful to have a fully automated computational method that can identify interfacial defects for us and determine these properties. So Ryan Sills and his postdoc Nipal Dekar, they set out to develop such a method. So I was just a contributor to this work, but I think it showcases very nicely what you can do with OVITO nowadays, because this entire machinery has been developed using our technology. So Ryan calls this the interfacial line defect analysis algorithm, or ILDA, and this is an overview of the different steps involved. So it first decomposes or segments the polycrystal into different grains to then focus on the interfaces separating these grains. It identifies coincident side atoms. So these are the yellow atoms here. These coincident sides are atoms that are sitting or which are part of both lattices, at least approximately. And the algorithm identifies these sites. And because they are part of both lattices, you can draw a Burgers circuit going through these sites without knowing anything about the structure of the interface. But you need some guidance on where to construct these Burger circuits, and for that the algorithm constructs a manifold representation, a mesh connecting all coincident sites, and then it basically constructs these half circuits connecting two coincident sites that are connected also by a mesh edge.
Does this work because I cross the surface twice, so the transformations cancel out? Is this why I can do the Burger circuit?
Yeah, so it could. Okay, but now there is nothing to cancel out because we are working with coincident sites. If you would not use coincident sites to go through the interface, then you have to worry about that, canceling basically one error with a negative step. Mm-hmm. And the algorithm can also then calculate the step height of these defects and constructs a discrete line representation, as we saw for DXA. So several frames of reference play a role in this process. We have the physical frame, that's where our atomic configuration, input configuration lives, and where we construct a closed circuit. Each half circuit is then mapped to the lattice reference frames, one for each crystal, using the PTM method, polyhedral template matching, which provides basically a stepwise mapping to the ideal lattice. And then each of these half circuits is mapped to a shared coherent reference frame. That's where the closure failure is calculated, the Burger vector, and we have two affine mappings, AF and BF, that can either be specified by the user or can be automatically determined by the method from the strain field surrounding the interface. So here's an example showing this method in action. This is a simulation Ryan did for FCC BCC interface in iron. He introduced Clyde dislocation loops in the FCC crystal, which then expand and impinge on that interface to give rise of interfacial defects that you see here, so steps inside of the interface. We take a closer look. You see the lattice dislocations, and they have reacted with the interface. So this is what the ILDA method gives as an output. So we see these disconnection lines. The green lines are lattice Shockley partial lattice dislocations, and the other colors represent four distinct types of disconnections. And ILDA gives you a table of these disconnections, their step heights, and the Burgers fraction Burgers vectors. So to summarize, so this is a new technique for identifying interfacial line defects in atomistic simulations. What is special about it is that it requires no structural input about the interface that we are analyzing. Would be in contrast to earlier approaches we developed for DXA. We have this coherent reference frame in which the Burgers vector is calculated. It can be either explicitly specified if it's known, or can be automatically determined. One limitation I should, of course, point out is that it is limited, currently at least, to interfaces that exhibit these coincident sites. I mean, here's another example showing it for a sigma 11 grain boundary in FCC. And this whole thing has been developed using the OVITO Python API and runs basically as a modifier step inside of our software. That's about interfacial dislocations.
Alex.
Question?
From this, so if OVITO gets an atomistic configuration with an interface, can you determine the disorientation, inclination, the properties of the grain boundary from this type of information?
Yeah, in principle, yes. We can. So the one pre-step to all these things that I described is the grain segmentation. I'm going to show some more about that, which calculates the mean crystal orientations for the two grains on each side of the interface. And I guess that's the information you're talking about. Exactly. I mean, of course, this is approximate. I mean, sometimes it's okay to work with this approximate information, right? I mean, it's of course subject to elastic strains. Of course, for example, these lattice dislocations that we saw in the BCC, FCC simulation, I mean, they influence the calculated crystal orientation in the FCC grain, right? And it can be a question whether you can work with that result, or you really have to by hand specify the grain orientation. So in a bicrystal simulation, you typically know it anyway, right? Because you set up the...
Yeah, no, with the crystal orientation, you can get the misorientation. But if you want to know inclination or the symmetry of the grain boundary,
okay, I see.
The grain boundary itself.
You really want to, with respect to the interfacial plane, yeah. But yeah, we have not cared about that, but it could be calculated, yeah. Mm-hmm. Parallelization. So what can we do, or what do we have to do to parallelize the DXA algorithm and to make it ready for large-scale parallel simulations? And that's something we started to think about, to work about, and Daniel will say something about that.
Yeah, so thank you. Yeah, again, this is very, very early work. We started thinking about it, and I will also, due to time, only present a very, very short outline of what we're thinking about. If you have any questions, ideas, anything else, let me know. I'm willing to explain a lot more, but also I'm open to suggestions about what can be done, because this is, again, yeah, it's very early. So what is the challenge of parallel DXA? Well, in an ideal sense, you don't want to do this in post-processing, because then you have saved all your data and wasted all your storage and all the time it took to output, but you want to do it on the fly. If you want to do it on the fly, that means you have to work with the data that the simulation actually gives you. So in the sense of large-scale AMD, that usually means that we have some kind of spatial decomposition. So we have a domain structure where each processor of our large-scale simulation only knows about a small subset of atoms and maybe some surrounding areas. But we have the atoms located in a distributed memory sense where not each processor can know about all atoms. This is not really a problem for the first step of DXA, namely structural identification. Crystal structure only depends on like a very localized set of atoms, so a very small volume. So usually the domain and its ghost layer surrounding it is entirely sufficient to run structure identification. However, the second step, as you remember from before, is a space-filling tessellation. And this tessellation, to be consistent throughout the whole sample and to be correct throughout the whole sample, needs to know more than just the domains in a domain, but also a much larger surrounding area. Or you need to know which atoms you actually communicate. So this is currently something that is very easily done on one processor, on a shared memory system, but on distributed memory, this is already quite difficult, and we'll talk a little bit about it in a second. And then there's the third step in DXA, which is the line tracing, where once we found our defect meshes or our dislocation cores, we have to actually construct a Burger circuit and then move that Burger circuit along the whole mesh to construct the full line. And if you have to move something along the whole range that crosses possibly one or more domain boundaries, you have to communicate that and synchronize those. So this is also currently not parallelizable. Some more details. Parallel tessellation, what is the general problem? Well, the problem is if you partition a set of points and then you construct a tessellation, that works fine in the central regions of each domain, but there is this interface region where basically both domains will think they are on a surface, even though they are not, because they don't see the neighbors across the boundary. So there's a boundary region that needs to be patched up. So basically what you have to do is you figure out which atoms are in the boundary, construct a tessellation of those points, communicate the constructed triangles to both original partitions, and then stitch everything together into one coherent picture to finalize your sample. So again, looks kind of trivial in 2D. In 3D, this becomes again more difficult. And it boils down to two main questions, namely which points belong to this border region, so which points do we actually need to communicate between processors. There are a few different approaches in literature. This is the one that I'm going to focus on because it seems pretty reasonable to me. Here you basically take your tessellation element, look at each point individually, look at its Voronoi cell and the circumsphere. And basically, if you place that circumsphere on any of the vertices of the Voronoi cell, and that is suddenly that intersects one of your processor domains or one of your domains of knowledge, you kind of know that you have to communicate this point to all the processors that it intersects. So in this case, this point would need to be sent to these 3 other processors. So we at least have a notion of where the point needs to go. It's a little bit more complicated for points that are on the convex hull, so really on the boundary of your tessellation, because here we cannot really construct spheres to find out where we need to send it. So the heuristic approach is to send it to one processor that's closest first, and if that doesn't work, send it to all of them. It's going to work out. This is summarized basically in this algorithm on how to get a consistent tessellation across processors. Not to focus too much on it, it comes with 2 communication steps where we send to one and to all neighbors. So this is quite costly because you communicate twice and possibly to a lot of targets. And it also involves running the full tessellation 3 times, which is also costly because you're basically doing thrice the work to just get one tessellation in the end. So there is an algorithm, but it seems quite complicated, has a lot of steps, and might be slow. But again, if it's the only solution, it is the solution you have to pick. So this is the first of our 2 problems addressed. Now we go to the second problem, the parallel line sweep. As I mentioned, we have spatial decomposition into MD domains, and dislocations are usually much, much larger than domains. So they usually cross one or multiple boundaries. So if we perform our line sweep, going from the discrete atomic representation of the defect core to the line by moving the circuit along, we will necessarily have spots where the circuit crosses the domain boundary and needs to be synchronized. And then you also need to deal with the fact that this domain might have already started on that dislocation, moving a circuit in another direction, they intersect, and so on and so forth. It will be quite a messy process. So for now, line sweeping is a sequential process that needs to be replaced with something that doesn't rely on these very, very long connected dislocation lines, and this is a localized approach. Here's our idea to construct a local dislocation line segment. Basically, you start off with your Delaunay element, and you again map the ideal crystal vectors, crystal lattice vectors to its sides, and you then compare it to your neighbor. If somehow your neighbor has a different set of lattice vectors, you know that there is some elastic incompatibility between these 2 elements, which means that usually a dislocation segment should somehow pass between the 2. So you have now a way of locally constructing very, very short dislocation segments as you can go from one cell to the next to the next. So this is what's shown here. You basically figure out the segments here, 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 and then you can do that locally for each processor individually, and you just have one final step where you connect all the segments, all the tiny segments that are pre-generated, hopefully making communication and synchronization much easier. But this is how you can locally construct small dislocation segments and then go to a large network. This brings me to the end of the DXA chapter. If you have any ideas, please let me know. And I will hand back to Alex for the final topic.
Okay. Yeah, last chapter of this presentation. Oops, sorry. So these are mainly just an outlook, or meant as an outlook, and ideas and thoughts, just to get the discussion started. The topic I want to bring up here is that it takes a different approach to analyze MD's trajectories in contrast to individual snapshots, instantaneous snapshots, as we saw before. So here's a little example, toy example. So think of a system of particles. So now there's no laser pointer, sorry. That form a cavity, right? And then we could, so this is a snapshot from some MD simulation. We could now apply Daniel's method for surface reconstruction to identify this void, calculate its volume, etc. Now, going to a later time in our simulation trajectory, the picture might look like this. Now we have 2 voids, and And the question is, of course, what happened in between? I mean, did this void split, or did a new second void nucleate? It's impossible to answer that question just based on these snapshots. And of course, we are running MD simulations, so particles have identities. We know exactly where each particle went. We have the full displacement field or displacement vector information available, and you can imagine that at least in principle, it should be possible to reconstruct from that information also the evolution of these voids. Right? So this example is supposed to show that tracking things or features in MD simulations over time requires approaches that are typically completely different from the methods we use to analyze instantaneous snapshots. Another example I want to show is grain segmentation. That's something that was mentioned earlier. In OVITO, we have the grain segmentation function, which can decompose a polycrystal into crystallites. So the different colors here represent different crystal orientations that can be calculated locally using the PTM method. And this grain segmentation algorithm is designed to even resolve these low-angle grain boundaries, so where you only have a very low contrast between the neighboring grains. And how does that work? So it transforms the atomistic system into a graph representation, which is suggested here. So where each atom, crystalline atom, represents one node, and they are connected by neighbor edges. These edges are assigned weights that measure the local misorientation to neighboring atoms. And so the final step is then to group these atoms. And Peter Larsen, who implemented this method, uses a graph community detection algorithm to group the nodes of this graph into communities of similar crystal orientation, and also based on the distance on the graph, so also which are close in space. Now you can think about what do we need to do to track grain evolution in time. And I mean, this is a typical problem, of course. You want to study maybe grain growth, so you want to track what happens to individual grains over time. And one of the ideas that has been brought forward by Peter Larsen was to extend that graph approach to the time domain, to build up a spatial-temporal connectivity graph, and then perform the community detection on that with a graph that spans the entire trajectory. Of course, you can imagine that for large simulations, long trajectories, this could become difficult because of memory problems. So you have to think about incremental approaches, I think, to solve that problem. And a few minutes left, so let's go back to dislocations again. Here we have a similar problem. So if you DXA can identify dislocation configurations in snapshots of an MD simulation, and it is difficult to connect these successive snapshots in time. I mean, dislocation networks undergo reactions. It's difficult to tell which dislocation moved where and what happened in between. One solution to this problem has been proposed by Nicolas Bertin recently, the sweep tracing algorithm. So this is the idea here is to project the discrete line representation onto a Naier tensor field representation and use that to find the most likely pairing of dislocation segments, so that we can then really follow the motion of dislocations. I personally have been working on a different approach, but so far haven't completed it yet, which is again going back to the underlying atomistic information. Right? I mean, everything, all information is contained in atomistic trajectories. So why don't we use that information to trace the motion of dislocations? And here the idea is that we basically detect elementary slip processes at the atomic level, then generate elementary slip facets So to build up a manifold representation of the slip surfaces and the slip paths of dislocation, and also the entire history or history of dislocation reactions will be contained in that representation. That's the idea. Yeah, with that, we are at the end of this presentation. Hope you enjoyed it. So at least I hope that you got at least some impression of how post-processing methods and software tools are being developed and what problems they can solve. And we have here today focused also a lot on still open challenges that still need to be solved, and we hope to find, for which we hope to find solutions and in the coming years. Okay, with that, thank you very much.
Great, thank you.